It's good to have Troy and Dave back. It's good to have Annabelle back. Thank you. And it's good to be with you all this morning. This week, I heard a story that I want to share, and again, I'm going to paraphrase. I can't remember the whole story, but it was about this woman who grew up in the South. She grew up in a very conservative household, and she went to school at a Southern school. She did everything the right way, and she was always taught that there was a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, and it was always about achieving. It was always about being the best, and she became a highly successful businesswoman, and she got to the point where she was burnt out. She was done. She was good at her job, but she didn't want to do it anymore. So she quit her job and was trying to figure out what to do, what she could do to make herself happy. So she went to a university and spoke with an advisor and said, what can I do? What can I learn? And they said, why don't you take this art class? A lot of our burnout business people take this art class. So she takes this art class, and she goes in there the first day, and the teacher tells her a couple of the ground rules. And the teacher says, one of the things that I want you all to understand is there's no right way and no wrong way to do things. And she immediately becomes uncomfortable. And then they say that there aren't going to be any grades. And she's really uncomfortable because she was always taught there's a right way to do things, there's a wrong way to do things, and it's all about achieving results. And if there are no grades, how will she know whether she's overachieving or not? So they get to this assignment in class, and they are told to draw a figure of this model in front of them. And so she is uncomfortable, unsure, but everybody around her starts picking up their utensils. They start to draw. So she says, she picks up her utensils and starts to draw, and she uses the phrase, because she's clueless but competitive. And that phrase, clueless but competitive, really struck me. And I heard the story in front of she was telling it in front of a live studio audience, and they all laughed because that's a funny phrase, right? That she was clueless about what she was supposed to do, but she wasn't going to let everybody else do it and her not achieve it. And I think if we're honest, and I know myself as I thought about this, if I'm honest, I've been there. I've been clueless, but I've been competitive. There are things that I enjoy talking about that I probably don't know enough to talk about. I was thinking about this week, and sports. I love talking about sports, and I feel like I know a pretty good amount about sports. And when I start to talk to people that maybe know more than I do, I will pretend like I know enough to talk to them. What's the difference between a 4-3 defense and a 3-4 defense, and which one works best to stop the inside run? Some of you are going, I have no idea what you just said right there. And some of you are going, oh yeah, I know that. But I will talk to you about that, and I will tell you exactly what I think. And I thought about this morning. Trying to process what this clueless but competitive meant, and I was concerned that on issues we don't fully understand, sometimes we have this attitude. Is this us, and is this, to me, and I was thinking about this, is this sometimes the church? Do we sometimes are clueless but competitive? And I thought about this, and I thought about what's the difference, what is the difference between the Church of Christ and others? And I think, there's the old saying, there's a lot of truth in every jest. I think if you've asked this before, somebody might have joked around and said, well, we're right. What's the difference between the Church of Christ and others? Well, we're right. Well, you're joking about that, but right, we're here because we think we do things the right way. We're here because we do things the way that God intended. And I don't want, and again, I hope that I've spoken in front of you enough, and you all know me well enough to know that my character and where I'm coming from, but I don't want to discount the value of knowledge at all. I do not want to de-emphasize knowledge, to know things. That's important. Proverbs tells us the discerning heart seeks knowledge. It says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all knowledge. Knowledge is important. We should seek to know things. I think the point that I want to make this morning, I want to talk about further, is we need to be consistently learning. and not assume that we know. Because when we assume that we know, we can be clueless but competitive. Well, we're right, so what we're saying is right. And I want to start in 2 Timothy chapter 2. I want to start in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and looking at verses 14 and 15. Paul writes to Timothy and he says, "Remind them of these things and solemnly charge them in the presence of God not to wrangle about words, which is useless and leads to the ruin of the hearers. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth." Earlier, Paul tells Timothy to remember Jesus. In verse 8, he says, "Remember Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, descendant of David, according to my gospel." He tells him to remember this and to remind everyone to endure and not deny him. Then he says in verse 14, "Remind them of these things," and then he charges them not to squabble over words, to not wrangle about words. There's a couple of things that I think this means for us. The first thing I think that it means is that there are things not worth fighting about. I think that, there's an attitude that we can take that everything that we discuss is important. Everything that we talk about is important. Everything that we do and say, especially because he's talking about words here, is important. And that we sometimes think everything is important. There have been arguments, and I have heard arguments about what color the carpet should be. I've heard arguments when we move the podium from up there to down here. And sometimes we use words that I think we wrangle about. One of the examples I was thinking about just this morning was when we do the Lord's Supper. And I don't know if you've ever been taught this, but sometimes when they switch from the Lord's Supper to the offering, they say, "now being a convenient time." Have you ever had anybody, to the men that have served, have you ever said that and somebody come up to you and talk to you about that afterwards? Well, it's not convenient to give of the offering. That's not why we're doing it then. It's not out of convenience. And I don't think that's what they're meaning there. But, and again, I realize that's a completely different subject. But I think what the point Paul is trying to make here is that sometimes we wrangle about words and wrangle about words that aren't important. And where the line can be is a difficult proposition. What words are important, what words are not important, what things we do are essential, what things we do out of tradition. But I think that knowing there is a line, knowing that there is some things that we may wrangle about that are not important is essential for us to understand. And Paul tells us why. He says, which is useless. There's no point in wrangling about words that are of no consequence. And he says, and it leads to the ruin of the hearers. Useless argument can turn people away. Useless argument, useless wrangling, useless fighting over words that are inconsequential can turn people away. People don't want to just be around people that argue all the time. If you're looking for an argument with every word that someone says, then you're going to turn people away with that. He tells us not to argue about words, and he follows up with, be diligent to prove yourselves, to present yourselves as a workman. Some versions that in that section say a constant worker. It's a continuous work. It's never ending. A workman, a constant worker, always is working to study, to learn, to improve, always trying to get better. And that is so that we are not ashamed. Ashamed of what? Ashamed of our responsibility as Christians. Ashamed of the work that we do. Ashamed of Christ. We are to constantly be working so that we are not ashamed. And accurately handling the word of truth. Now, if Paul tells them that they need to be accurately handling the word of truth, one of the things I think that implies is that the truth can be mishandled. Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3, he writes about Paul, and he says in verses 15 and 16, it says, "And regard the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given to him, wrote to you, and also in all his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which some things are hard to understand, which the untaught and the unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the Scriptures, to their own destructions. Peter had previously talked about looking forward for these things, looking for the new heavens, the new earths, and he says that Paul wrote about these, and some of them are hard to understand. And people distort them and change them and warp them to say what they want them to say, as they do the rest of the Scriptures. Now, they are distorted to their destruction, but they're distorted due to possibly a lack of understanding. Maybe they're clueless but competitive and they want to be right. But Peter says that some of the things that Paul writes about are difficult to understand. And we tend not to view Scripture that way. We tend to view it as the complete story, as easy to understand and comprehend. I had John read this morning from John chapter 20, where it talks about Jesus performed other miracles and signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe. See, John had a purpose. John recorded what we needed to know and understand who Jesus is. And we need to understand that we have the word of truth, that we have what we need to understand who Jesus is. But it wasn't a minute-by-minute manual, but we have what we need. I want to flip over to Romans real quick, Romans chapter 12. Because I think one thing that will help us with this mindset, with this continuous improvement idea that we need to have, I think one thing is as I talked about John having a purpose, I think we need to understand our purpose. We need to understand what we're on this earth to do. So I want to go to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And it says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." So Paul writes that we are to present our bodies a living and holy sacrifice. I don't know about you, when I typically think of sacrifice, I think of death. I think of, Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice because he gave his life. But Paul says here we're to be living sacrifices. So what does that mean? That means giving all you have. When we think about death sacrifice, you're giving all you have. You're giving your life. You're giving it up. So if we're living sacrifices, that's giving all that we have, our heart, our mind, our body, our soul, living for God. Each moment we're to serve and to glorify God. At work, at home, in the car, whatever we're doing, we're to be living and holy sacrifices, which is our spiritual service of worship. So he says this, and then he says, do not be conformed to this world. I fear, and I speak for myself as much as anybody else with this, but too often we're naive to how much the world affects us. It's so easy for us to look at the Jews in captivity and see how Egypt affected them, how the fear that Egypt instilled, changed their hearts. It's so easy for us to look at the Roman Empire and see how it affected the early church, or how Judaism was affecting the early church. And we're fine talking about these, we're fine looking at those examples, but maybe we're not so comfortable looking at how the world affects us. There is such a thing as American Christianity. I saw a tweet the other day that was about this guy who wrote a conversation, a fake conversation between American Christians and Jesus. And it said, American Christians, what are we supposed to do if somebody punches us in the face? And Jesus responds, turn the other cheek. And the American Christian responds, we're going to hit them back, show them who's boss. Because America emphasizes strength, right? Americans are tough, we're bigger, we're better, we're stronger than everybody else. If you don't think American Christianity exists, in our songs of faith and praise is America the beautiful and my country 'tis of thee. And again, I don't want this to sound, and I hope I've built up a reputation to be able to say this, I don't want this to sound anti-American, because we are extremely blessed to live in a place that we can freely worship. And that is a blessing. That is not something that everybody has. You can ask people who have traveled in the Middle East or overseas. Ask our missionaries in China. We are extremely blessed. But some other points of pride, economic prosperity, military might, those are unrelated to the church. In fact, I think if you look at materialism and violence, those are pretty contrary to the focus of Jesus. And the church and Jesus isn't tied to any country or civilization. There are some, probably in biblical times, who did not think that maybe the church would outlive the Roman Empire. But it did. And the church, if Jesus does not come back before that, will outlive the American empire as well. But we can't be conformed to this worldly way of thinking. We have to think higher. Jesus transcends any nationalism. So Jesus says, don't be conformed to that. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is a constant renewing, because the world will continue to try to conform you. Just because you were transformed once, just because you think at baptism you were transformed by the renewing of your mind, doesn't mean that you won't be worked on and try to be conformed later. And it's not always a fast process, which is why we need to guard against it. Do we believe or do things because that's what our ancestors did? When we think that we know everything, the world will work on us. We are transformed and Paul says we are transformed so that we can know the will of God, which is good, acceptable, perfect. And we will consistently be transformed as we try to further emulate Jesus. And I say this knowing that we're human. And it's so easy, as I mentioned with the conformity of our surroundings, it's so easy for us to look at others and say, well, yeah, I've talked to this Methodist before, and they didn't want to believe because that's what they'd always done. We want to take this and point it outwards, but I think we need to focus, and we need to make sure that we're focusing on Jesus and consistently being transformed. I've never heard this said outright, so I don't want to point any fingers, but maybe it's just something that I've thought over the years. But we must act like everything's right? How will we convince people that to come to us, to listen to us, if we don't have everything right? I don't have any statistics on this. I don't have any proof of this, but anecdotally, I know some that don't come because they saw somebody who claimed to have it all right do something wrong. I think we need to let people know, we need to show people that we're consistently striving to be more like Jesus. We're consistently striving to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. That's a consistent process. We need to prove ourselves a workman so that we may not be ashamed. Because when we do that, when we consistently work, when we consistently strive, then we can be what we talked about last week. What I talked about last week in Matthew 5:16. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's how we let our light shine, by consistently trying to be better. Because we know we're going to mess up. So if we set ourselves up to a point where we say we know everything and we have everything right, we hurt our message because we mess up. And Jesus tells us to let our light shine so that they may see God. And that's a consistent process. We need to be constantly striving to be more like Jesus, keeping an open mind to Scripture, constantly searching, so that we aren't clueless but competitive. And again, there's some things I said this morning that I probably wouldn't have said 5 years ago. Maybe I've gotten better, maybe I've gotten worse. It's up to you to decide, because you should be searching it for yourself. It's up to all of us to be a workman. It's up to all of us to prove ourselves, to show ourselves approved as a workman, to not be ashamed of the gospel. If you need help with that this morning, if you want guidance, if you want us to pray over you, or if you want to be baptized into Jesus' body, we encourage you to come forward as we stand and sing this morning.